All right, so we're going to be going over DBQ number 5. I'm going to go ahead and present my screen. All right, so DBQ number 5, you had, of course, the statement here: reform movements in the United States sought to expand democratic ideals. Assess the validity of this statement with specific reference to the years 1825 to 1850. Okay, and of course, you're going to be using the documents and your knowledge of the period to construct your response. Now, if you notice on the AP review, I gave you stapled again. Mostly because it's probably the easiest methodology to use when you're talking about specific time frames. So I'm going to go ahead and go through this real quick with some of the background information, and then we'll get to the documents here in a second. Obviously, we're talking about the time period of the antebellum. So when you're talking about social, when it comes to reform movements, civil rights issues, and everyday people problems, you have, of course, during this time period, the abolitionist movement growing. So without question, the abolitionist movement encompasses William Lloyd Harrison, Frederick Douglass. You also have Wheatley, and the like. Okay, so the abolitionist movement is certainly happening during this time period, but remember, during the antebellum period, you also have the movement towards public schooling, which you can attribute to Noah Webster and to Horace Mann. You have the Second Great Awakening, which is, of course, Charles Grandison Finney and George Whitefield and all the rest of them. And then, of course, you also have Dorothea Dix and her movement to basically, for lack of better terminology, civilize prisons and mental institutions. That's all happening during that time period as well. You have the temperance movement kicking off. And that, of course, is well before my favorite Carrie Nation, but still, there's still a push to get rid of alcohol. And of course, there's the earliest stages of the women's suffragette movement, because you are going to get the Seneca Falls Convention before 1850 and 1848, 49. So you're going to get the Declaration of Sentiments as well. So all of that is social, these reform movements. Civil rights, of course, plays into the abolitionist movement, and everyday people problems. If you're really going to look towards everyday people problems, the antebellum period is always going to equal the movement towards the Civil War. And of course, everyday people are making the decision at that point: do we move west? Westward expansion, which of course is by extension manifest destiny. Okay, so all of that would be playing into this everyday people social reform. Technological inventions during this time period, you're going to have a big boost in railroads being constructed. You're going to have, of course, the very earliest telegraph machines, along with the code provided by Samuel Morse. That's going to link the country a little bit better. And of course, steamboat travel. That's all going to go into bolstering and linking the country. Artistic, music, artwork, new forms of media. When it comes down to it, the West is the, I guess, the muse for artistic expression during this time period. And writers during this time period that are really going to make some headway is James Fenimore Cooper. He writes Last of the Mohicans, amongst many others. And of course, leading up to this, you're going to have a whole host of poets, and this is, of course, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and the earliest poets you can really think of. Emily Dickinson during that time period. You can certainly look towards that as kind of the earliest American contributions towards writing, but you also have the Transcendentalist movement during that time period. I probably should put that down. Which is people like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Scarlet Letter, and then people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, and for that matter, Henry David Thoreau. He wrote Walden Pond. All of that was self-reliance, the idea that the individual does it. All that would be artistically applicable to what we're talking about here. Who are the presidents? If we're talking 1825 to 1850, obviously it's the earliest stages of JQA. And of course you have Jackson, Van Buren. Have 31 solid days of William Henry Harrison. A tumultuous 3.5+ years of John Tyler, of James K. Polk. You have Zachary Taylor kicking the bucket pretty quickly afterwards, and you finish it off the very tail end with good old Millard Fillmore taking over for Taylor's death. Now, the major political group that you always have to remember during this time period would be the Great Triumvirate of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, serving in a multitude of capacities. When you're talking about that time period, they're serving as Secretary of State, they're serving as Speaker of the House, they're serving as senators. They're all over the map. Calhoun, of course, was vice president under Jackson, at least for the first term. Remember, he was the one that Jackson wanted to hang. That being said, all three of them are going to have a very weighted and very solid addition towards that time period. Legally, it's the very tail end of the Marshall Court. John Marshall will die about halfway through this time period. But he's going to, of course, have his run-ins with Jackson. Marshall's going to side with Native American tribes during the Trail of Tears. And that's where famously Jackson's going to say, Marshall's made his decision, now let's see him enforce it. Okay. But they're also going to have the Bank War during that time period. That Marshall also says, hey, the bank's totally fine. Now, he says that in 1819, so it was before that. But Jackson is certainly going to have a say about whether or not the Bank of the United States is relevant. Okay, all that happens during that time period. Now, the big Supreme Court cases pertaining to the Civil War don't happen until the 1850s, so it'd be outside of this question, if you will. Economically, during this time period, you would have the Panic of 1837. All of that happening because of the Bank War. thrown the economy off. And of course, you would have westward land, their sale, the over speculation, all of that leading to basically the Panic of 1837 as well. All of that kind of plays into that. The stock market, of course, would be fluctuating during that time period because of that massive fluctuation. And then, of course, because of westward expansion, annexation of Texas, Mexican War, all of that, you are going to have some war debt out of that, and you are going to have acquisition of new territories, which always brings with it new resources. And then finally, diplomacy during this time period. This is after the time period that John Quincy Adams is Secretary of State, so we're not going to necessarily talk about his additions. However, he is instrumental in the writing of the Monroe Doctrine, which is in 1823, so right before this time period, but it's going to have a large impact on how we handle our business moving forward, obviously. So when that occurs in 1823, it pretty much switches the policy of the United States government when it came to westward expansion. We've talked about, of course, westward expansion, but let's talk about specifically Texas. They get their independence in the 1830s, basically 1835-36. They become independent. And then, of course, they are annexed. It means to add on the United States right before Polk comes into office. If you remember, Tyler kind of throws that on Polk's presidency from the word go, if you will. Okay. The thing that Jackson wouldn't touch during the 1830s, Polk has to deal with. And of course, Polk then parlays that into the Mexican War, which brings us, for lack of better terminology, California, amongst a few other states and territories, what becomes known as the Mexican Cession. But remember, he also brings us Oregon out of 54, 40, or fight. A mentality that we're going to hold on to Oregon no matter what. So all of that is the background to this time period. You know, the Treaty of the Mexican War is going to be the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But all of that is in the backdrop of that question. So reform movements in the United States sought to expand democratic ideals. So what are they really asking here? They're asking, is this statement valid? So if the AP board hits you with a question where here's a statement, is it valid? What they're really asking at that point is the statement true? Now, you can, of course, go either way on this, but whenever they ask a question about validity, you have to ask yourself, what way are the documents taking me? There are three ways to answer the question at that point. Yes, the statement is valid. No, the statement is not. Or in some ways it's valid, but for the most part it's not. There's really no other fourth option there. Now, again, you're probably going to want to take a strong stance one way or the other, depending upon how you read the documents. And of course, it depends on which documents, which documents you're going to use. If you have 5 documents, if 4 of them are pointing you in one direction, ignore the 5th one, or address the problems with the 5th one. Because remember, these documents are perspectives of people at the time. Doesn't necessarily mean that they were correct, doesn't necessarily mean that they were true in their mentality. You can be wrong with your opinion in the long run. Okay, you can be wrong with your opinion in the short run. It doesn't matter. So looking at the documents, always ask yourself, which way are they wanting me to go? Okay, so what are they asking? Are reform movements in the United States expanding democratic ideals? Is that what they were really trying to do? So looking back at our little group here, they're really looking towards this stuff right here. This is really going to be the bulk of what you're going to be answering, what you're going to be using to make your arguments here. So that being said, We have a whopping two of you right now, so I'm not going to call you on the carpet. I'm just going to walk you through the documents. So if you want to chime in with questions, obviously, if you want to use the chat function because you don't want to necessarily chime in, that's fine too. But feel free to chime in whenever you need to ask questions. So, Document A, the fourth annual report from the Society of Reformation of Juvenile Delinquents in 1829. All right, so here you go. This is the Society for Reformation of the Juvenile Delinquents. We might feel a pride in the reflection that our young country was the first to adopt the penitentiary system of prison discipline and the first to attempt to prevent the commission of crimes by seeking out the youthful and unprotected who were in the way of temptation, and by religious and moral instruction, by imparting them useful knowledge, and by giving them industrious and orderly habits, rescuing them from vice and rendering them valuable members of society. To confine these youthful criminals where no or scarcely any distinction can be made between young and old, or between the more and less vicious, where little can be learned but the ways of the wicked, and from whence they must be sent to encounter new wants, new temptations, and to commit new crimes, is to pursue a course as little reconcilable with justice as humanity. Yet, till the house of refuge was established, there was no alternative. All right, so what are we going to glean out of this fourth annual report? Okay, they're saying at this point, we've not done a bad job, but we can do a better job. This goes right hand in hand with Dorothea Dix. So you absolutely could bring Dorothea Dix as your outside information on this document. They're saying, what is the purpose of the prison system? Is the prison system to punish regardless of who they are and what they did? Or is it designed to reform them and give them better instruction and better moral compasses, if you will, to then become better citizens once they are released? Okay, so it's really just asking a question of what are we doing this for? What is the court system and what is the penal system doing? All right. So the information from the document, they're at a crossroads. And we're still having this debate today. So this is a time-honored debate. Do we punish criminals or do we reform them? This person is saying we can take pride in the fact that we are helping to reform some people, but we're not doing it completely the way we should. So it's kind of a 50-50 document. You could use it either way. Okay. Now, is reforming these people so that they can be better members of society a more democratic way of looking at things? This is also where you can pull in, if you don't remember too much about Dorothea Dix, you can pull in the idea that, hey, back in the old days, we had penal colonies where the British would send people to Georgia or send people to Australia to punish them, for debts or whatever else, for minor petty crimes, instead of reforming them. Is that a democratic way of doing things? Just sending them away, telling them you have to go someplace else against their will? Or is that really, hey, we're giving you another option. Instead of sitting in a dank prison, we're going to send you off to a colony where you can work and die on your own? Again, it's kind of depending upon which way you want to go with it. As you can see, you can make this argument any which way you want. Okay, so long as you can back it up through evidence and support yourself, you're fine. But again, document A could take you both ways. So this is a both-way document. It's either saying, hey, this is what we're actually doing, or it's saying, hey, this is what we should do in the long run. It's kind of up to you how you want to read it. Okay. Document B, and by the way, the point of view of this fourth annual report, keep in mind, if this is an annual report, it's not really supposed to have a point of view. It's supposed to be telling you exactly how it is right now. But yet they're still kind of raising the question of what is our purpose here? Which way are we going with this? So they're not saying this is how we have to go, but they are saying this is where we stand. Okay. Now, they give you Charles Grandison Finney. If you remember, we just talked about that Second Great Awakening. So they are bringing the Second Great Awakening back in here. Document B, when the churches are awakened and reformed, the reformation and salvation of sinners will follow. Going through the same stages of conviction, repentance, and reformation, their hearts will be broken down and changed. Very often, the most abandoned profligates are among the subjects. Harlots and drunkards and infidels and all sorts of abandoned characters are awakened and converted. All right. So he uses a lot of big words, okay? But what he says is when we wake up the churches, when we get them fired up and everything, we start saving people, okay? We start reforming people. Very often the most abandoned profligates are among the subjects, harlots and drunkards. Harlots are, of course, whores. These are prostitutes. Drunkards and infidels are people who are non-believers. And all sorts of abandoned characters are awakened and converted. All right. So again, this is kind of a 50-50 document. You could go either way. Is the opening of churches to inject some moral and ethical, kind of belief structures into society, is that democratic? Or is that actually not democratic? Is that something that would work against a democratic ideal? Because keep in mind, could an infidel, somebody who doesn't believe in God, still participate in society? Yes, you could say Grandison's actually going against this by saying you have to repent and you have to reform. That's not necessarily a democratic way of viewing things. However, at the same time, if is somebody who's a drunkard going to actually go vote and participate in society? The argument may not be. They may not. So you again could take the document both ways. Now, of course, the point of view of Grandison, Finney, is they need to go to church, and you need the church to be reawakened to help out with societal values. That's his point of view, that we have to reawaken everything, which of course goes right in line with the actual movement. Document C, engraving by Patrick Reason, 1835. Am I not a woman and a sister? This is, of course, a drawing of a slave, a shackled slave, okay, a slave woman, by the way, who is kneeling and praying, okay? So this is, again, going to go into the abolitionist movement. Can you enslave somebody that believes the same religion as you? Can you believe in a just and moral God and then allow for slavery to continue? So this engraving is certainly abolitionist in its tone, okay? It's pleading for the humanity of people. Now, again, you could say during this time period, you can argue this either way. This is a 50-50 document as well. You could say, since abolitionism is growing during this time period and people are starting to join the movement during the antebellum, you can make the argument that's democratic because you're getting people out to support a cause, a democratic, Republican cause of trying to free people. But you could also make the argument that since abolitionism didn't really work, that we had to fight a war down the line, that this was not solved through voting. You can make the argument that this is somewhat anti-democratic, that it didn't actually bolster the democracy of the United States. And of course, even though Reason is obviously an abolitionist in his point of view, it could be taken differently by other people. Document D, Samuel Morse, we also pinpointed in his Imminent Dangers of the Free Institutions of the United States in 1835. In our national infancy, we needed the strength of numbers. Now emigration is changed. Naturalization has become the door of entrance not alone to the ever welcome lovers of liberty, but also for the priest-ridden troops of the Holy Alliance. Now immigrants are selected not for their affinity to liberty, but for their mental servitude and their docility in obeying the orders of their priests. So Morse is anti-Catholic, if you haven't picked up on that. Priest-ridden, obeying the orders of their priests and the Holy Alliance. This is a worry about popery, the Pope coming in and really meddling in our affairs. Okay, Morse continues, it may be, Americans, that you still doubt the existence of a conspiracy. Do you wish to test the existence and its power? Test it by attempting to change in the naturalization law. Take the ground that such a change must be made, that no foreigner who comes into the country after the law is passed shall ever be allowed the right of suffrage. denying the right of suffrage to somebody who is an immigrant. Change the law to prevent their influence. This is not a 50-50 document. This is definitely an anti-democratic document, that they are not true Americans, therefore they shouldn't vote. Okay? They are more apt to follow the Pope than they are democratic institutions. You can certainly use this to counter the Finney argument earlier that churches need to be awakened and open. Morse is saying it depends on which churches. Some churches don't do that, So again, it's not a 50-50. Morse is kind of showing that he's very much anti-Catholic. Okay. Document E, William H. McGuffey in his readers. This goes along with public school education. In case you don't know who William McGuffey is, he was a school teacher who created readers. These were basically the earliest forms of reading textbooks. Okay. And he has a tie locally, by the way. If you go up to Miami University, the education department is actually named for him. So the McGuffey Reader is a big deal. My grandparents had a bunch of them. These were the earliest forms, again, of textbooks. So this is going to go right along with Horace Mann. It's certainly going to go along with Noah Webster and the push for public school education. Okay, and in his reader in 1836, it's going to say, the good boy, whose parents are poor, rises very early in the morning and all day long does as much as he can to help his father and mother. When he goes to school, he walks quickly and does not lose time on the road. My parents, he says, are very good to save some of the money in order that I may learn to read and write, but they cannot give much, nor can they spare me long. Therefore, I must learn as fast as I can. If anybody has the time to lose, I am sure I have not. When he has finished his lesson, he does not stay to play, but runs home. He wants to see his father and mother and to help them. Sometimes he goes with his father to work. Then he is very glad, and though he is but a little fellow, he works very hard, almost like a man. When he comes home to dinner, he says, how hungry I am, and how good is this bread and this bacon. Indeed, I think everything we have is very good. I am very glad I can work. I hope that I soon shall be able to earn all my clothes and my food too. When he sees little boys and girls riding on pretty horses or in coaches or walking with ladies and gentlemen and having very fine clothes, he does not envy them nor wish to be like them. He says, I have often been told and I have read that it is God who makes some poor and others rich, that the rich have many troubles which we know nothing of, and the poor, if they are but good, may be very happy indeed. I think that when I am good, nobody can be happier than I am. Okay. So McGuffey is normalizing the idea that, hey, you can be happy even if you're dirt poor. Okay. This is a reading passage that would have been used in schools where the predominant kids that are in the class are poor. So take whatever you want out of this propaganda, but it is that. McGuffey's saying, hey, it's okay to be poor. You can still be happy. You don't need a lot of money. You don't need to envy those that do have money. Just be happy with what you have and earn your keep. Okay, which is a nice thing to always say to poor people, but this is certainly in 1836 going to be a prevailing mood, if you will, when it came to this. So McGuffey is certainly going along with the lines that the people reading this are certainly going to be normalizing their condition. Okay. Again, you can take this however you want. You can go 50-50 on this. You can take it as, hey, these readers were available to poor people. Okay. These readers were available so they could learn how to read and write, so they can elevate their station. And one of the outside information that you can go along with this is by 1836, we are the most literate nation in the world. We have people that can read. That's not the case across the globe. Most people at this time period, if they're going to church, they're depending upon the priest to read the Bible to them. Okay, if they are in countries that don't have schooling, and you're born to a farmer, well, then you're just gonna be a farmer. That's what you are. In the United States, you can be born to a farmer and elevate yourself to even president of the United States. Lincoln, of course, is going to do that, amongst many others. Okay, this mentality that McGuffey is putting out there is through hard work and dedication. You can raise yourself up, you can elevate yourself. Okay, certainly Jackson does. Certainly, this is important to the Adams family. John Quincy Adams is pressured very early on that you're going to Harvard and you're going to be a lawyer. like your father, because that's what you do. You go and learn. Okay. Now, of course, you could also point to the glaring weakness here. You'll notice the good boy does this. What does the good girl do? This is very one-sided here. The good boy has the ability to do this. The good girl does not. Okay, the good boy can grow up and become a voter. The good boy can grow up and become whatever he wants to be. She, on the other hand, does not have the same opportunity. So again, you could take this as a 50-50, that while we're growing the democratic institution that's already available to these young men, we're denying the rights of young women. Okay. So again, you could take this as being very sexist in its tone. You can also take it as this good boy probably is white. This is probably not somebody that is Asian, African. This is somebody that is white. This is not going to be somebody who is born to a minority. Document F, the Constitution of the Brook Farm Association in 1841. In order to more effectually promote the great purpose of human culture, to apply the principles of justice, and to love our social organization in accordance with the laws of divine providence. Remember, divine providence capitalized as God. To substitute a system of brotherly cooperation for one of selfish competition, to secure to our children the benefits of the highest physical, intellectual, and moral education, to institute an attractive, efficient, and productive system of industry, to diminish the desire of excessive accumulation by making the acquisition of the individual property subservient to upright and disinterested uses, to guarantee to each other forever the means of physical support and of spiritual progress. We, the undersigned, do unite a voluntary association. Okay. What in the world are they doing? They're putting together their own association. Okay. This could be 50-50, but for the most part, this is promoting democratic institutions. We are coming together to promote ideals, to promote reforms, to promote our community, our society, whatever the case may be. These are individuals by their own right coming together and signing off that they are going to do things for the collective good. Okay, and what are they really doing here? According to this, they're going to substitute a system of brotherly cooperation, okay, to secure to our children the benefits of highest physical, moral education, to institute a productive system of industry. They're building a society together. We're going to have industry. We're going to pass down, farming, lands, if you will. We're going to come together and make sure nobody is falling behind. It's kind of a collective effort, if you will. This can be linked directly to things like the Mayflower Compact, that we're all coming together to form a society together. Okay, you can even link it, it's a constitution, so you obviously can link it to any of the state or national constitutions. Okay, so that would certainly promote the idea of a democratic mentality, that we're coming together to work together. Okay, document G, Orestes A. Brownson, an address before the Society of Mystical Seven at Wesleyan College in August of 1844. I propose to bestow my attention on several species of the genus quack reformers. The effort to cut loose from the past and to create an entirely new social and industrial order is the species of quackery practiced by our professed social reformers. These systems of reform disown the past, condemn what has been, and propose the creation of an entirely new social order. It is to no man's credit that he disowns what has gone before him. But what is this past which we in our folly condemn? It is that which has made us what we are. It is our mother. Alas, he is a bad son who curses his own mother, and no good can come to him. All right. This is a very convoluted way of saying these reformers don't know what they're talking about. They're going against our founding principles. They're going against their mother. Their mother. Now, of course, this is when you could bring in Republican motherhood. Who taught the principles and the procedures of the government to the children? It's the mother. again, you could use this also to link the public school education, because now we're replacing the home where mom is teaching the kids how to read and write, but also teaching them the systems of government. Now it's going towards a public school education, that they're all collectively in a community coming together and having schooling together. So document G could take you a multitude of different ways. In the end, what they're really saying at that point is these social movements are anti-democratic. You could 50-50 on this one. You could say this guy's full of it, or you could say, you know what, he's got a point, that they're going against many of these social reforms might actually be going against the founding principles of the government. Okay. Document H, this one, of course, is another one of those visuals that's designed to throw you off. The drunkard's progress from first glass to the grave. What is that really? It goes right in line with the temperance movement, that alcohol causes bad things to occur. That, you know, he starts off, he's just socially drinking with people. You know, he's starting, and, you know, step one, a glass with a friend, a glass to keep the cold out, you know, to fend for himself, if you will, against bad winter weather or whatever. A glass too much. So now he's starting to progress toward becoming drunk and riotous. Okay. And of course, the summit attained, jolly companions, a confirmed drunker, which means he's found a group of drunk friends to hang out with. Step 6, poverty and disease, because he spent all his money on this drink. Forsaken by friends, nobody will talk to him. Desperation and crime, he's stealing from people, he's holding people up. And then finally, death and suicide. You know, and so nicely they have him blowing out his brains in step 9. Okay. And of course, this is all going over the home that he is neglected and the family that he's neglected as well. So this is going right in line with the idea that alcohol is causing a ruination to the home, a ruination to the family, and by extension, a ruination to the United States. Okay. And of course, yes, and health class, I'm sure Semino would be able to take you step by step through the whole thing. Okay. Now, this is in 1846. Of course, the Library of Congress donates this one. It's pretty self-explanatory. This could be utilized to talk about, hey, if the democracy was working so well, why are so many turning to alcohol? You could also point to, if the economy was working out so well, why are people drinking as much as they are? And then, of course, you can make the argument, is this really the progression, or is this really kind of a misguided thing? Which, of course, and to bring up health class, you can talk about how some people are predisposed to have a weakness for this. Some people do have an alcoholism running in the family. This is a situation where this is a disease, and it is something that people legitimately suffer from. So to kind of characterize that this is what the drunks always do right here, little disingenuous, obviously, for our own knowledge to this time period. But back then, does it tell us something about democracy if this guy is doing just fine and all it took was a little glass of alcohol to make him blow his brains out at the end? The answer is probably not. That there's probably way more societal problems here. Okay, there's way more involved. There's problems with the family. There's problems with the economy. There's problems with societal values in general, if this is genuinely how they view this. Okay. Then, of course, document I, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Seneca Falls Convention, the declaration, I should say, and this would be the Declaration of Sentiments that eventually comes out of this in 1848. But we are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in a government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife. And strange as it may seem to many, we now demand our right to vote according to the declaration of the government under which we live. She is correctly pointing out that women have been taxed. Women are under the laws of the said government, and yet they don't have any say. This is where outside information could come in. The 14th Amendment. If you remember, we talked about 13, 14, and 15. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13th was abolition of slavery. 14th was the rights of citizenship. 15th was giving African American males the right to vote. That doesn't happen until the Civil War, obviously, but you can say that this was falling on deaf ears because in 1848, she's saying, hey, we're being taxed, we're being expected to follow the law, and yet we're still subjugated under our husbands because our husbands are the only ones that have the right to vote. And if we don't have a husband, then we have no say whatsoever within this government. Now, in 1865 through 1867, they are going to pass amendments 13, 14, and 15 to free the slaves, give them rights, and give them the right to vote specifically. And all three of them, you're talking about 15 to 20 years later after the Civil War, all three of those are going to ignore women. And women are going to use the 14th Amendment. They're going to cite the 14th Amendment in the suffragette movement of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the same individuals, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, they are all going to protest and say, we said this in 1848. It's still true in 1908. You know, like this hasn't changed one little bit. And even so, it hasn't changed at the same time. It has changed for other groups. African American males were slaves in 1848, and in 1868, they're not only freed, they're not only given equal rights, they're also given the right to vote. So women are certainly going to be complaining that the eventual freeing of the African Americans isn't going to extend to women at all. That the right to vote, suffrage, is not going to be given to women until 1920. So again, you can certainly look at it, are we really a democratic society if an entire, let's be honest, 50% of the population is being ignored? They're not allowed to participate. They're still expected to follow the rules. They're still expected to pay the taxes. They're still expected to follow the social norms and customs. And yet they don't have any say within the actual government structure. Okay, so that is what all these documents are playing into. Again, what you have to do is come up with a thesis statement that can answer the question. The question, of course, again, is at the very beginning, they gave you this statement: reform movements in the United States sought to expand democratic ideals. Is that what these reform movements were doing? And keep in mind, these reform movements that we talked about, these reforms right here, are these reform movements actually making us more democratic? Okay. One of the things that also should have piqued a little bit, the great triumvirate of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster are going to also show us the Democrats versus the new group, the Whigs. Okay. That's another political movement that is trying to enfranchise people that don't believe in Jacksonian policies, the Jacksonian Democrats. A lot of these social reformers right here would have considered themselves Whigs. They would not have gone along with Jacksonian mentality. They would not have gone along with the bank war. They would not have gone along with the Trail of Tears. They would not have gone along with westward expansion. They certainly wouldn't have been manifest destiny individuals like Polk was, because Polk was a Democrat too. Okay, they would have been Whigs. Okay, keep in mind, Spotty Lincoln, good old Abraham Lincoln in 1846, who basically says, "I'm not agreeing to this Mexican war until you show me the spot on the map where this occurred." Spotty Lincoln was a Whig too. Okay. And he would have been maybe not an abolitionist at that point, but he certainly would have been a free soiler. And during this time period, just to kind of keep in mind that during this time period, the free soil movement which would have taken comfort in the Wilmot Proviso, the idea that if we take this territory from Mexico, we're not going to allow it to be slave territory. All of that's playing into this. So all of these social reforms during this time period, are these democratic? Are these making us more and more democratic, or are they counterproductive to that? That's the question they're asking. Now, they've given you documents, as I've said already through this, they've given you documents on this, could go either way. You know, you could make the argument either way. So what your job is here and this is what your grade's going to be for this one, can you create a thesis statement out of this? Can you take these documents? Can you take what you already know from the time period and create a thesis statement that makes sense and that could be supported by multiple arguments? The easiest way to do this is to focus on groups or individual reform movements. In the documents, they give you the public school movement with the McGuffey Reader and the constitution of a group coming together to create a better community, if you will. So all that plays into schooling. You have the abolitionist movement, you have women's movement, you have temperance movement, you have all of those reform movements. You have Dorothea Dix and prisons. The smartest and easiest way is to use some of those movements. You also have, of course, religion with the Second Great Awakening. You have a whole multitude of different movements. You can choose to say, yes, they promoted democratic institutions, because some of those documents will help you to do that. You can say, no, they did not. They were counterproductive, and some of the documents would help you to prove that. And you can say some of them worked towards more democratic ideals, while others were more concerned about their own. Also, a legitimate thesis, okay? What you have to do in your thesis is, in one sentence, and this is a part that many of you are struggling with, one sentence, make the argument, sum up your argument. What are you proving? And in this case, they're making it quite easy for you. You're either supporting or refuting or 50-50ing that statement. And again, do not repeat the statement, but you're making the argument. One, you're either, yes, it's becoming more democratic. This shows that they were more democratic. No, they were not, or it worked out 50-50. Of course, try and sound a little bit more academic than what I'm making it right now. I'm trying not to just clue you into writing a thesis at this point. I want you to try and formulate this on your own. Again, that's what I'm going to be grading. That's what I'm going to be looking for. Can you write the thesis clearly and directly, making an argument, one sentence that sums up what you would argue throughout the course of your essay? All right. That being said, any questions? Out of this capacity crowd of 2. Thank you for hanging in there, by the way, all the way through.
Which of the movements would you use? Because there's a lot that's going on, and it feels like not all the documents cover like 3 of them, and that would give us an easy 3. Like this one did, but this one not so much.
Okay, so the smartest thing to do at that point, Hannah, is if you're confronted with, here's a multitude of different ways to argue it, what do you feel more comfortable with the argument? What do you feel would be the easiest route for you to cover? What do you feel most comfortable talking about based upon your outside knowledge? So if you're like, I would love to cover the prisons, but I don't remember much about Dorothea Dix, then you leave that one out, because you're not going to be able to cover enough ground and territory with that to make it an acceptable answer. If you have much more on the, let's say, temperance movement, and you can talk about how that eventually grows into a much larger movement, and you could even say, hey, that eventually held on to promote an actual constitutional amendment later on, then you certainly could make that argument and then link it to future events. That would give you plenty to argue with one way or the other, okay? You could certainly say, hey, the suffragette movement is much larger than just this one document, and you can bring in a ton of outside information. This one kind of left it very, very thin when it came to document support, okay? This was not an easy question when they promoted this back in 2002. Okay, this was a tough question to answer. So I don't expect them to give you these very blanket, vague DBQs normally. I think they've changed that, but in this uncertain time of education, I worry that you might get one that's a little vague on documentary support, because they're expecting you to pull a lot more information out to back up your claim. So in reality, even if you don't believe what you're writing on this, you need to find 3 that you can make at least somewhat of an argument on.
All right. Just because they only gave us one document for the suffragette movement, I was thinking of combining that and abolition to kind of say, look, these two were pushing for human rights.
And you can certainly do that. You can certainly say, what is the purpose of, and this could, again, your outside information could be from the very beginning, the Declaration of Independence was talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For whom? You know, if this is truly the bedrock of a democratic institution in a democratic country, how in the world can you leave 50% of the participants out? And then how can you enslave another percentage of the population? Okay, so you certainly could say, hey, from the very beginning, we proclaim to be all about human rights and enlightenment ideals, but did we really follow through with that? And these reforms certainly would be then, in your argument, more of a democratic push than the initial democratic push of the revolution.
I I was thinking those two and then having public schools because there was a lot of documents on that it seemed like, and then the Second Great Awakening as another one because I feel like there was always an established thing of religious freedom and there was a guy who was obviously anti-Catholic. And then there was also something of a separation of church and state, and they're like, but the church needs to get more involved. And it's just like, well, that's confusing.
Yes. And you can link that to the earliest and even to the modern day argument, are we a Christian nation? You know, the modern argument of were we founded on Christian ideals? And most of the time they would call it Judeo-Christian principles. Are we, you know, founded by a reliance on the Bible, which of course you could link directly to City Upon the Hill, and you can talk about the Massachusetts Bay. But what I always bring up is, okay, link it to Jamestown. You know, is Jamestown really, you know, a religious effort? It's not. It's an economic effort. So, you know, this comes back to what are our founding principles? Now, you could, of course, make the argument: is Finney, in his effort to get the church more involved, is that helping democratic institutions without really realizing they're doing it? You know, are they, you know, is the byproduct that they're actually helping out, or is it really a misguided, you know, argument that the church is a democratic institution?
Yeah, that one would be the more difficult one, but there's just so many documents that fall around it that it feels like I can't really avoid the Second Great Awakening one if I want to get enough documents in there.
Well, keep in mind as well, and I'm going to throw it out there too. Remember what Charles Grandison Finney did. His camp meetings always had a bench of people at the front called the anxious bench. Describe those people. Do you remember?
I feel like it's either the people that needed saved the most, but in his ideal, or it was the people that were most involved with the church. It was one or the other.
Well, keep in mind they were not involved. These people were not part of the church worship, and they're new converts basically. But these were women. He made sure that women held the front and center part of his camp meetings, and he's going right in line with Republican motherhood. If the mother is teaching the children how to read and write, if the mother is teaching them about democratic ideals, then the mother could also teach them about Jesus. The mother was the key to the family. Okay, so you can very much link Charles Grandison Finney to the women's rights movement, because if Charles Grandison Finney is saying women have the ability to teach the children not just about Republican principles and ideals, but also the church ideals, well, then how in the world is she not participating in the democracy?
Oh yeah, I could that would be a nice way to like make the two topics flow into each other almost.
Yep. So this one was a very tough one because you had to know so much outside information in order to make the argument.
Yeah.
So, not surprisingly, this was one of the lowest scored DBQs in AP history.
Yeah. I probably would put public schools as my third just because it's kind of like it falls in line with the pursuit of happiness thing, how you can kind of become what you want to be.
Rising up from nothing, yes.
And even though it's not quite there because most of the students are going to be white and males, it's still an improvement upon just having private schools
Well, keep in mind, if you were
or
British,
homeschools.
French, whatever,
Yeah.
if you were over in Europe, if you had the means, you had a tutor. There wasn't a
Yeah.
public school. You had to have a tutor. And even the early stages of the colonies, it was tutors. John Adams had a tutor. He didn't until he went to Harvard. But the other link that you can make to this is we have an outcrop of a tremendous amount of higher level institutions, whereas in Europe it was a very finite amount of people that went to Oxford or Cambridge or the Sorbonne or whatever else. If you went to university over in Europe, you were wealthy and you were very, very intelligent. Over here, we have Harvard, we have Yale, we have Princeton, we have Brown, Penn, William and Mary, the University of North Carolina, Duke. I mean, by the early 1800s, not only are we getting public schools, but we're also getting universities cropping up left and right.
And that's probably just because of the amount of kids we had educated in public school that would even think to go on to a university.
And keep in mind, this was started, and this goes back to the Second Great Awakening. We started these universities specifically. Harvard was started to make people ministers, to certify our religious leaders. But over time, they expanded the law, they expanded the medicine. They started realizing, well, if we're going to certify our ministers, we better darn well start certifying our lawyers, our doctors, our everything. So all of these groups that are being produced by these institutions are almost forming a new level of society. And not all of them are wealthy, because keep in mind, Lincoln comes from nothing. And by 1860, he's president of the United States after learning how to read and write on his own, basically, and becoming a law clerk and a legal scholar by apprenticing himself. He never went to college, so this new form of like, hey, we got to produce these new leaders through a system is uniquely American.
Yeah. Yeah, this one just really sucks. It's doable, but it sucks.
It's a big picture, and my word of choice always is it's very vague. It allows
Yeah.
way too much leeway to argue one way or the other.
And I think their thought process was this will be easier because no matter which way you have more information, you can still make the argument. It's not leading you one way or the other. But at the same time, then you have to rely more on your outside information. And I guess that's kind of the whole point of the AP exam.
Well, that, and I worry that this year, with only 5 documents associated with the DBQ and such a large, uh, expanse to cover, I have a feeling that our AP question this year is going to be very open ended and very much open to interpretation. And you're going to have to know a lot of information on your own to bolster your argument. So it's good to kind of do these review exercises on bigger picture questions.
By the way, I have some questions that aren't related to the DBQ about like getting your computer set up for the AP test because I looked at the calendar and realized the original date that it said was like a week from Friday.
Yes, May 15th is your date.
Youch.
Yep. What's up?
It talked about running different tests to make sure that your computer can do the exam even. I didn't understand that part of it.
They have what are known as diagnostics on there, where if you click on it, it opens up the window as if you were taking the exam. So you're going to want to run those diagnostic tests, because the whole point is if it doesn't load properly, then your test won't load properly on the 15th either. Okay. So the stuff I forwarded to you, you're going to want to go through that on the AP website to make sure that it loads up.
All right. So it's basically just clicking something and making sure that it works.
Yes. So don't feel like, oh man, I don't want to start a test now or something. No, you're doing that to practice for your system, making sure that your computer works and that the online portal actually opens up. So no worries, you'll be able to you'll be able to click right out of it afterwards. It's just going to give you a little text box that'll say success, or it'll say, I can't remember what it says, but it just kind of says your system is up and running and is capable of handling it, because I'm not sure what they're using, whether it be WebEx or whether you need an add-on to Google Chrome or whatever you're using. The whole point is to test your system to make sure everything's up and up, and you're able to, excuse me, to actually take the exam.
I'm just trying to see if I can pull it up on the email and make sure that everything's good to go, so I don't have to
Okay.
bother you again.
No, you're not bothering me. It's fine. That's what I'm here for.